All right. Should be recording now. So today we have Dr. Graham Oppy joining us. So to start with, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your work?
Okay, so I'm a philosopher. I work at Monash University. My primary field is philosophy of religion.
Yeah, so one of the things I like to do with some of these interviews is, I know I've seen you do a lot of other interviews and stuff, and you sometimes go right to the academic meat of it all. But I kind of want to get a little bit of personal stuff, out of the way as well. So, like, what was your? I think I might have read this at some other point, but what was your religious background and upbringing like?
Okay, so my family has been in Australia since all of my great grandparents were in Australia in the 1850s. They all came out to the goldfields from England mostly. And almost all the branches of my family were Methodists, so they'd fallen under the spell of the Wesleys, or at least the church that the Wesleys established. So I grew up Methodist, and my extended family still has a bunch of Methodists in it. My parents, so my father at one point trained to be a preacher, a kind of lay preacher. Over the course of his life, his faith kind of waned, I reckon. My mother's didn't, but my father's did. So I went to Sunday school and church as a child up until about 12 or 13. And then sort of thinking about things for myself, I just decided that I didn't believe any of it. And that was kind of it. I've been an atheist ever since.
Yeah. Was that like kind of painful at all, or was it more kind of like it just evaporated? Or if that makes any sense.
So it's hard to remember. I think it was, I can remember sort of talking to myself about it and kind of assessing things. And it wasn't particularly painful. It was, as I recall, it was quite a short period of time, a couple of weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, and I just went from sort of being a believer to not.
That's interesting how it seems like different people react differently. I mean, depending on how deep in what age they are and how deep into it they are. Like I remember for me specifically deconverting, like I would look up at the stars when I was a Christian and think like, wow, God. And I remember one vivid moment where I looked up and I was like, we're all alone. like in the moment it was like, it's not painful in that way anymore, but it just I don't know, that moment stuck out to me. And it's interesting how it's just so different how people process moving in and out of religious belief like that. So what got you interested in, what got you interested into like philosophy of religion specifically? Because obviously I think if I'm remembering correctly, didn't you do stuff with like philosophy of like language? I could be completely butchered. What did you do before philosophy of religion, and then you got into philosophy of religion?
So I got interested in philosophy way back. So on my 16th birthday, I was given a copy of Bertrand Russell's autobiography, which I read, and I thought, wow, that's all seems really interesting. I want to know more about philosophy. And when I went to university, I did 2 majors, I did 2 degrees, one in science and one in arts. I did maths and physics and philosophy and history and philosophy of science. And you can see the kind of Russell kind of background to that, because he studied maths when he was at Cambridge. So that was kind of inspiration. Then I went off and did a PhD in philosophy of language. And interestingly, I hardly studied philosophy of religion at university. There are not lots of courses in Australia or New Zealand in philosophy of religion. There was one where I did my undergraduate degree taught by Bruce Langtree, and that was it. And when I went to graduate school, there was no philosophy of religion there either. So I came out with a PhD in philosophy of language and thought that I would be a kind of philosopher of language, philosopher of mind. That was the kind of area that I was kind of destined to work in. I came back to Australia and I was unemployed, and my wife had a job and we were in Canberra, and they needed at the ANU, they had a need for someone to teach philosophy of religion. So I used to lecture a course. And they asked me whether I could do it. And so I had nothing else to do. So I said yes and started teaching myself philosophy of religion. And sort of through that semester, I was kind of 1 week ahead of the class in the readings the whole way through as I was kind of educating myself. And then the next accident was that I applied for a research grant for a postdoc. And what I said in the application was that I'd write a book about reformed epistemology, which I didn't know anything about, but that was okay. And I got the grant. And so I started working on what I thought would be a chapter on ontological arguments. And that chapter grew into a book. And by the time I'd finished the book, I was kind of hooked on philosophy of religion at that point. So it's kind of, as I've said elsewhere, it was really a kind of series of accidents that I ended up in philosophy of religion, even though I'd always had this interest in philosophy of religion, but I never thought that it would become a kind of professional interest.
All the theists are like, why God? Why did you let him get into philosophy of religion? I'm just kidding. It's interesting too, definitely. That's interesting. You got into it through the ontological argument, because I know actually got into, I'm wading into the waters of philosophy of religion. So I'm not as conversant as some of the other people that might have interviewed you, but I'm still reading up, from my skill level. But I know, the ontological argument is every time, I read Arguing About Gods, and just for now, I guess maybe just because I'm stupid, but the most boring part to me was the ontological chapter, because I was just like, oh my God, but that's just because I need to learn more. But
well, it's also so that chapter the part of Arguing About Gods on ontological arguments is a kind of supplement to the book on ontological arguments. So it's less interesting because it's not engaging in the same kind of direct way with the arguments as the kind of chapters on the cosmological arguments, design arguments, and Pascal's wager, and so on.
Right.
So I don't blame you.
No, I eventually will get that book. I just, after reading that, I was like, I need to wean myself into this a little bit more before. So I guess, so you accidentally got into philosophy of religion. How have some of your views evolved? Not necessarily just it could be philosophy of religion related, but you already said you were raised kind of in a Methodist context and then didn't believe in God, but is there any significant changes of mind that you've had, or your views have evolved in any way?
Yeah, I guess lots, but this is kind of common in philosophy, I think. So there was a time when I was an undergraduate when I really liked Wittgenstein and read everything that Wittgenstein, I was going to say that Wittgenstein wrote, but lots of his books were kind of mashups put together by other people from his notebooks. So it's not clear that he wrote them really. He wrote the sentences, but they kind of got organized by somebody else. But my excitement about Wittgenstein kind of wore off by the time I'd been in graduate school for a couple of years. So that's one kind of example. That kind of thing's quite common. So there are people philosophers that you read that are very influential for a while, and then they just become less influential, and other things take their place. Right? Yeah. So it's kind of boring to recount the other examples, I think. So I'll just stick with that one.
That's interesting, though. As I'm reading more and more, I'm seeing Wittgenstein cited more and more. I think I just read a book called I forget the author's name. It's called The Everlasting Check. It was about David Hume, but it brought up comparing some of Wittgenstein's ideas to Hume's and all this other stuff. So I know that's somewhere I need to go next. But now you just told me he's not very good.
Well, no, I didn't say that. What I said was he had less influence on me.
I know. I'm just
over time. So,
all right. Well, it's got some of the personal stuff out of the way. So the book that I wanted to spend most of the time talking about is the Atheism, the Basics book. That you wrote more, I think it was 2018 maybe was the year, I can't remember. So what motivated you to write this book specifically?
So I've written a bunch of books for academics, and they're kind of typical academic books, so they're not particularly easy to read. And over the last sort of I guess it's 7 or 8 years, I tried my hand at writing some books which I hope would be accessible to a wider audience. And Atheism, the Basics, was the hardest that I've tried to write a book that would be accessible to a wider audience. And even it's not entirely successful. There's one extremely difficult chapter in there, but I hope that most of it is reasonably accessible.
Must have been why I liked it so much. No, it was good. So I think you in the beginning, in the acknowledgements, I think you made a comment about like that you said you wrote it somewhat for like your atheist people that you work with and stuff like that, and colleagues as well. So before we get into like the specifics, do you want to just give a brief outline of the book itself? Like what, just general like airplane view of what you're doing.
Okay, so from memory, it's got about 7 chapters. So you're going to test me out here. The first chapter is just sort of what is atheism and how is it related to a bunch of other things that it regularly gets confused with, like materialism, for example. The second chapter is a bunch of pen portraits of atheists across history. And my idea was to pick people from different times, different places, to illustrate the kind of little, often overlooked fact that there's quite a long tradition of atheism in some parts of the world. And there are kind of interesting questions about the extent to which there were atheist traditions elsewhere, but we just they didn't leave any traces, so we don't have any information about them. We might come back to that later. So that was the next chapter. Then there's a couple of chapters about the social science of atheism. So what have psychology and sociology and demography and so on to tell us about atheism, particularly kind of in the contemporary world, because again, studies of atheism, well-done studies of atheism, are a fairly recent thing, at least in the West, probably anywhere. Then there's a chapter on sort of common objections, so answers to common objections to atheism. That chapter owes quite a bit to a book by Russell Blackford and Udo Schukling. It's got the word 50 in the title. I just can't remember. So it's kind of modelled on what they did. I mean, I didn't steal their arguments, but the idea for that chapter was kind of modelled on their book. Then there's a chapter roughly on arguments for atheism, and that's a chapter that's really kind of heavier going than the rest of the book. And then there's a kind of speculative chapter at the end about, so what's the future of atheism? And that takes in, I look at what some theists have said about the kind of contemporary decline of atheism, and suggest that they're not really looking at the right data.
Yeah, and I think you briefly, well, we'll get to that too, but I think you briefly discuss how there's too much optimism on the atheist side as well. Like atheism is going to take over the world, and it's like you got to, take a step back, a step back from that. So I guess first let's start with some key terms. So what is? I mean, there's like the first chapter you go through several key terms, but the most important things we're talking about, atheism, the basics, is what is atheism?
So I think of atheism as a thesis. It's the claim that there are no gods. Full stop. That's what atheism is. And then atheists are people who, well, let's just say that believe atheism. You might try some weaker word like accept, and that might still do, but I think that I'm going to go with belief. Now, when I define atheism, there's a bunch of other terms to define at the same time. So one of them is theism, which I take to be the claim that there's at least one God. so that makes it the negation of atheism. And agnosticism is then it's kind of hard to define at this point, because it's not so much that there's a thesis. It's more, agnosticism is about an attitude. Agnostics suspend judgment on the question, the decision between theism and atheism. So an agnostic neither believes that there are no gods nor that there's at least one God. They're just undecided. They have thought about the matter, so they're kind of aware that there's this question, but they're just not taking sides.
Right.
And then my last category is the innocents, the people who've never heard of God, or who are simply, for one reason or another, unable to make a judgment. So it's not like the agnostics, who at least are in the position where they understand what the claim amounts to and can weigh it up. Innocents would be people with advanced Alzheimer's, or infants who are 2 weeks old, or chimpanzees. I mean, things that we don't credit with the capacity to even have the thought that there's at least one God.
Everyone knows infants are atheists. We all know that.
so that has been said, right?
I know.
Part of the reason why I use that example is to combat that claim.
Right. Do you want to define? I think you define gods as well. God or gods.
Yeah,
because that's still distinct from theism specifically. So amongst theisms, there are monotheisms, which say that there's exactly one God, and polytheisms, which say that there's more than one God. And I'm thinking of gods as something like the things that have power over everything else. That's very roughly the way that I'm thinking at it. So the things that have and exercise power over everything else. And there's different ways that different people have thought about their gods. So if you think about, say, the Greek or Roman or Norse gods, they're the most powerful things, the most powerful sort of individuals, right? The most, in a sense, they're like people. It doesn't mean that there's nothing that fails to have power over them, because things like the fates in Greek mythology actually have some power over the gods, which is slightly tricky. But if you think about, say, the Abrahamic God, one of the distinctive features of the Abrahamic God is that God has and exercises power over absolutely everything else. Right? So it makes a kind of good fit for that kind of religious tradition. Right. Theist God isn't. Sorry.
I was going to say one last thing. There are some people in the Abrahamic tradition who insist that God, with a capital G, is not a God.
I was about to say that as a joke.
But the way that I'm thinking about what it is to be a God, they just think that there's exactly one God. They think there's just one thing that has and exercises power over everything else. And on my way of thinking about it, that's enough to make it a God. I mean, their worry is that if that kind of a small g God is too much like us,
right?
And they insist that their God with a capital G is kind of completely other. But there's nothing in this definition that goes against that idea, right? Their God can be transcendent and not in space and time and so on. What matters is the having and exercising of power. And that bit seems to be right. I mean, I don't see them putting their hands up and saying, no, my God's not like that.
Yeah. You beat me to it. I was about to make a joke about that because, you have a crude misunderstanding of what God is. And I feel like, I mean, you'd think that they wouldn't push back on that, but I feel like some of the more classical theist people that are really, hit it hard, they want to push back on every, I don't know. Anyway, so one of the things I was going to ask too, we joked about a little bit with the infants being atheists. So it definitely seems like, some definitions of atheism, I know, like if you go to if you Google atheism or atheist or whatever, like an Oxford Languages supplies Google with their whatever definitions they get. So it's like the disbelief or lack of belief in God is one. And then I think even there's some philosophical, I mean, it's not standard across all philosophical encyclopedia or not dictionaries, but there are some that have lack belief in there. So would you recognize that as a legitimate but unhelpful definition, or not even legitimate at all to contain lack of belief?
So
that make sense?
I don't know. I have a very relaxed attitude about
Mm-hmm.
the use of words, right? So I want people to be clear about what I mean when I'm using the word atheism, and so
Right.
I've given a definition because it's important. I keep using it throughout the book. I don't really care, right? And I don't think other people should about different uses of the word in different communities. It's just that once you start talking to people who use the word differently,
Mm-hmm.
you have to be clear about, I mean, either you, for the purposes of your conversation, you agree that you're going to use the word a certain way, or you're just very careful to translate backwards and forwards so that there's no confusion. Because what matters is not the word. What matters is the thoughts that are being expressed. Now, I have in places pointed out that there's a certain convenience and perhaps even a kind of a reason why you should prefer the way that I go, because this fourfold distinction between, if you think of a proposition, believing that it's true, believing that it's false, suspending judgment, or just not having the capacity to entertain the proposition at all, applies across the board. And we do use the word agnostic in the way, at least sort of in philosophical circles, for suspension of judgment about a proposition, not just about the proposition that there are no gods, or that there's at least one God, but in any subject matter, right? And so that's some reason for thinking, at least in my community, that there's a kind of broader reason why you would want to use the words the way I do.
Mm-hmm. No, that makes total sense. I mean, it just, as someone on social media, someone on social media and Twitter and stuff, in some of these circles of like that, people that like philosophy of religion, it's like, sometimes I feel like I agree that the way you use the terms is the most helpful way to do it. But there's sometimes there's so much focus on like, just let people define their own terms and then have the conversation after that. I mean, that seems logical to me.
It really doesn't matter how people use the words, unless their usage kind of leads immediately into sort of contradiction or something like that. But so long as they've got a fairly consistent usage. And I mean, one of the things that's going on here is that in some circles, the term atheism is now a positive term and people want to be atheists, right? And so there's some contestation about exactly what falls under the term, so that whether you get to use the term or not.
Right.
I don't care how people use the words. I just want them to be clear in their conversations.
Yeah, that makes sense. Another, near the end of that chapter too, we've been defining terms for a while, but one of the other ones was, I think the subheading was like, can atheists be religious or something like, so how do you see atheism and religion is that possible to combine the two?
So it's sometimes said, for example, that there are strands of Buddhism that are atheistic. Now, and certainly there's nothing like God with a capital G in some strands of Buddhism. Some strands of Buddhism have lots of little g gods, though. It doesn't seem on the face of it that it's impossible to have a religion that's got no gods in it if you've got the kind of the other stuff that's built into Hinduism and Buddhism, if you've got karma, reincarnation, and so on. That could be the makings of a religion without God. Now, some people will want to argue that those things don't count as religions, and there's another argument to be had about what's the most useful way to think about religion. But on the way that we ordinarily think about these things, when we do classifications of the religions of the world, Hinduism and Buddhism definitely count as religions, right? And so on the kind of, at least at that kind of crude level of thinking about it, yes, you can be an atheist and be religious.
Yeah, that's that's interesting too. I think I can't remember the specific definition you used for religion. Had to do with like costly material donations to like an organization. I can't remember the exact, but I thought that was an interesting, because I've been thinking about that too. Like there's all the people, in certain circles, it's like, well, everyone's religious because you value stuff. It's like, that's a totally worthless definition of religion if literally everyone's religious. If you just value things, like get over it. Like, that's silly.
So the definition that I use is one that is not original to me. I borrowed it from the person who came up with it, as far as I know, is Scott Atran, who's an anthropologist. And for him, it's a kind of stipulative thing. He was studying a whole lot of different cultures, and he wanted not to get embroiled on the long-standing issues about trying to define religion and distinguishing religion from culture and things like that. And so he has this, it's quite a complicated definition, which I won't try to repeat. But interestingly, it was the way that he framed the definition, it wasn't clear that kind of atheistic versions of Buddhism and Hinduism would fit it. So I modified the definition a little bit so that it would apply to those kinds of cases as well. I think it's pretty good if you go around and you test it against actual religions. So there's this, as you said, one part of it is that there are these kind of costly sacrifices of time and money, goods, and so on, that they're either sort of offerings to the gods, or there are offerings that are supposed to sort of meet your help you along the way to enlightenment. And you can see that in the religions. Most religions do have sort of costly entry requirements. And so what's the point? Well, part of the point is that it enables you to manage the kind of difficult things in life, death, suffering, and loss, and so on. And so the giving the commitments. But then there's another part of it, which is there's sort of bringing people together in communion. So that's another part of this definition as well. As I said, it's quite complicated, and I can't sort of rattle it off word for word.
No, that makes sense. I thought of a few phrases and try to, like, it was a complicated one, but it was definitely interesting though, because I've been thinking about that topic a little bit, about how to best define religion, because it seems like, and this is not true of everyone, but it seems like a lot of religious people want to define religion in a convenient way for them to make as many other people religious, as they can. But anyway, I'm not going to go on a tangent about that. But so the next chapter was had to do with, I think it was 12 atheists that or people that were either atheists or like it seemed like that they were possibly atheists or something like that. And my question was, of the people that you kind of gave a little sketch biography of, who were the most inspiring and or at least interesting for you to kind of look into?
So I think they're all interesting. So Jean Mellier and Holbach, Baron Holbach, two of the most interesting ones. So Mellier is a Catholic priest, and he lives in a small village somewhere in the Ardennes, and his superiors have kind of noticed that he's a little bit odd, but he's kind of doing his priestly duties properly, even to the extent at the end of every year, if he's got leftover money, which he always does, he just distributes it amongst the poorer parishioners. So there's not really much that makes him stand out from lots of other priests. But over the last decade of his life, he was writing a book, or at least writing down his thoughts. And his thoughts were extraordinarily unconventional for the time. So for a start, he was an atheist, but he was also a kind of international socialist as well. And he had kind of quite revolutionary ideas about a whole lot of things. When he died, somehow, and I don't quite know how this happened, the manuscript survived, and there were copies made, and they circulated anonymously starting in Paris from the 1730s, and they were enormously influential in the kind of the formation of the thought of the people who influenced the French Revolution. So he's a really interesting historical figure, and at least in English hasn't really received much attention yet. So the first translation in English of his book is only about 10 years old.
Wow.
One of the people that he influenced was Holbach. So Holbach actually published a book in about 1770 called The Good Sense of Jean Molière, where he picked out some of the good bits in Molière. There are other people. So Voltaire is somebody who borrowed a lot from Molière, but Voltaire was a deist, and he was definitely kind of politically conservative, so he ignored huge tracts of what Molière had to say. Another person was the Marquis de Sade, so his book Philosophy in the Boudoir was mainly cribbed from Molière as well. Okay, so that was, anyway, Holbach. So Holbach's probably my favourite figure. So when Holbach was about 30, his very wealthy uncle died and left him a fortune. And so what Holbach did was he established a salon in Paris, as you did if you had lots of money in the day. And all of the famous intellectuals and many of the kind of the leading political figures of the time came to Holbach's salon for the conversations. And the conversations were very, and they just ranged over whatever people wanted to talk about. And there's a kind of inner circle, a coterie of Holbachs who were all kind of revolutionary people. And so it's quite remarkable that Holbach was able to get the people that he did to come to his salon. There's kind of speculation about why it was. Partly it was because the food and the drink were just so good. Partly it was because he had such a great library. And partly it was because he was just such a great conversationalist himself. And while he was doing that, he wrote an enormous amount. All of his books circulated anonymously in Paris. Nobody knew who was writing them, writing all of these atheist tracts. He's not such a great thinker, like such an original thinker, but his influence was very considerable because of the volume of stuff that he pumped out. And it wasn't really discovered who'd been writing these tracts until well into the 19th century, long after he was dead. So he's quite an interesting figure as well.
Yeah, that was definitely an interesting chapter to read for sure. So moving on to the next one. I mean, everyone knows that atheists are immoral, untrustworthy, criminal, nihilists, and are always miserable. And all the social science backs that up. So defend yourself.
So the interesting thing is that the social science doesn't back it up, though. I guess in a way this is still controversial. There's lots of badly done social science, and that seems to support those kinds of conclusions. But there's lots of data that runs directly contrary to it. And there are kind of arguments which should be being pursued more widely, I think, about the kind of inadequacies of attempts up until now to study atheism. Not so much having to do with the kind of definitional problems about what atheism is, though perhaps there's some difficulties there, but just to do with the kind of markers of atheism. So when you do psychological tests, you usually fill out questionnaires that are designed to probe what your beliefs are. It's a kind of standard thing. So there are these standard questionnaires. And so there's these standard questionnaires for determining the religiosity and the religious orientation of people. And it just turns out that the questions that are asked that are supposedly identifying the class of atheists are just so terrible that they couldn't possibly hone in on an interesting class of people. They kind of um, atheists with fairly well worked out and settled views that you would like to study. There's just no questionnaires that identify reliably that class of people in the cohorts that the psychological studies follow. And this is true even for really big religious studies. So there are very big religious surveys that are done, and they're hopelessly inaccurate on the basis of the terrible questions that they ask when they're trying to work out who, discriminate between the atheists, the non-believers, the people who just don't participate in organised religion, and so on, which all tends to get sort of bundled up into a single unholy bundle. Right.
I thought that was interesting too, because it seems like with like some of these studies in the social sciences, that like depending on whatever you already believe, you just kind of latch on. It seems like people just latch on to certain studies. So like when it comes to like Christians, obviously you've talked about some of that, but it's also on the atheist side. Sometimes it's like, obviously like there's a lot of data to sift through, but there are some atheists that are just like, we're smarter. Here's this one study that shows that atheists are definitely like, it's like, okay, there needs to be more. It just seems like the pattern to me is like, basically, I mean, you took a careful look and tried to show that like there's not enough data to really come to like really firm conclusions about a lot of the things people are making claims about, which is, it seemed like what a lot of the message of that was. But even though that's the case, people just kind of attach themselves to whatever studies fit whatever they want to be true, and then just are like, hey, we're smarter than you, and the Christians are like, you guys are terrible. It's like, like, or theists,
So that's right. And there are lots of studies, and each new study that comes out, there'll be whoever it favors, people will say, well, look,
right.
Here's your smoking gun. Here's the evidence you really need. But in fact, that's not the way that science or social science works. So you want studies, you want to replicate them, you want to have a look at the kind of meta studies, but then you want to look at the perspective that the people writing the meta studies were coming from as well. So in the end, what you want is kind of meta studies from a variety of perspectives, and then you have a look at them and you try to make a judgment. And often it's very difficult to come to any conclusion other than, well, we need to do more research here.
Right.
And yeah, that's a kind of theme of those two chapters of the book.
Yeah, and one of the other, well, it's kind of that chapter, or the one that was more specifically linked to social science, and the next one, which had to do with, I guess, stereotypes. They're closely related, but I think the one after didn't use specific statistics as much as the one before. Yeah. But let's just start with the fact that everyone knows that atheists are fundamentalists. So what do you have to say about that?
So that's but that's such a weird thing to say, right? Mm-hmm. So though the word fundamentalist has changed quite a bit from its origins. Now, I'm not going to remember exactly when it is. It's about 1910 or 1911 or something like that. There's a meeting of evangelical Christians of various kinds, and they hammer out a list of fundamental claims that evangelical Christians should subscribe to. And that's where the word fundamentalist comes from. It's people who subscribe to that. It's a list of 5 or 6 claims. Right. There's no set of claims that atheists sign up to, right? There's nothing that kind of matches anything like what that kind of notion in the history of fundamentalism. There's nothing like that in the history of atheism, and atheists disagree about pretty much everything, including what atheism is, right? We've already discussed that. Whereas you would think that there is, and it's important what the fundamental claims of the fundamentalists were. Part of it was about, I'll use the wrong word probably, but the inerrancy of Scripture, right? There's nothing for atheists that corresponds to Scripture and plays the role that Scripture plays in the lives of fundamentalists. So, now you might say this is all kind of taking the whole thing a bit too, in a sort of flat-footed way. And when people say that atheists are fundamentalists, they've got some kind of analogy going on that I'm completely missing with the remarks that I've just made. But I can't imagine what that would be. right? And one thing to bear in mind here, and a different kind of point, is that atheists spread right across the political spectrum, they spread right across the social spectrum, and so on. Whereas when people are talking about fundamentalist Christians, they're talking about Christianity's on a big spectrum, and there are liberals, and they spread right across, social, economic groups, and so on. But the fundamentalists are of a very particular kind, right? So it would be weird if, Christians had this huge spread, but atheists were all concentrated in one fundamentalist group. That just makes, that kind of point just makes it seem obvious that the claim that atheists are fundamentalists is really quite fundamentally flawed.
I like that. But some people would push back probably and just be like, well, I wouldn't call all atheists fundamentalists, just some of them are. But at the same time, I think, and again, this is my opinion, I think it's used in the same way, like trying to make more people religious in the same way they want to take kind of religious words and apply them outside to other people. So I understand the analogy, and I understand that it can be a technically correct definition now. Like if you look it up, fundamentalists can be used in certain ways, but I think you said dogmatist. I think that was the word that so the ones that are really tightly held to certain beliefs, it might be more accurate to say that these are dogmatists rather than to try to just extrapolate like fundamentalism from a religious context and then apply it.
Right. And that would be better, because then it will be true that there are atheists and dogmatists, right?
Yeah.
And so at least the analogy will now work. Of course, that's true. You might like to know the relative percentages, but good luck finding that out. I can't think of any study that's going to be very helpful in helping you to assess whether more atheists are dogmatists than Christians are dogmatists. Yeah.
But they're political ideologues. So what about that?
Well, maybe some atheists are. Lots of atheists are as apolitical as much of the population in pretty much every Western democracy is. So, also, one of the things that's kind of tricky about that will be, if they're political ideologues, what's the politics? So what is the political ideology that they're signing up to? I have atheist friends who are Republican voters. I have atheist friends who are Democrat voters. Which ones are the ideologues, or are they all?
Right. It's hard to say. And again, that kind of accusation doesn't really make sense if you especially I'm in American context, and so all the craziness that happens over here, and it seems like a silly accusation to say to the broad group, atheists are, especially prone to political extremes. Not really. Not compare. The kind of evangelicalism in America is, for anyone watching outside of America, is absolutely ridiculous. But yeah.
But then again, amongst even people who would call themselves evangelicals, not all of them are Republicans. Not all of them were Trump voters, right? In any group that's of people that's that big, there's going to be a distribution of opinion, and you'll be taking a big risk if you suppose that anybody that's in the group has to be of a certain kind when it comes to their politics or whatever. Yeah.
Actually, just from the inside, because I'm kind of familiar with some of the inner workings of American evangelicalism, but Trump really did, this is kind of off topic, but Trump really did fracture a lot of American evangelicalism, because they're the people that are like, this is not consistent with our, our identity, with our beliefs, and the other people. So it actually really did a lot of, as you're saying, there's people on both sides that start to they're in a certain camp, and then they're coming to radically different conclusions based on, their certain beliefs. But we all know that you're an atheist because you hate God. That's the next.
Right. So
why do you hate God?
So that one's really weird. So I can't remember what I said, but probably it makes about as much sense as supposing that I hate the Easter Bunny, right? That is, my view is that there's no such thing. Why am I going to waste my time? Well, first of all, what sense does it make from my point of view to hate it? I don't think there is such a thing, so there's nothing there to hate. But even if somehow or other I could hate non-existent things, why would I bother, right? Even if it was possible, why would I bother?
Yeah.
Right? The idea that atheists hate God is a really strange kind of fiction, I think. Anyway.
I think you use an analogy of like, I think watching like a horror movie, and like I think you're scared in the moment and you have like real emotions, but like you don't really think you're gonna die, like as you're watching a horror movie.
So that's a kind of that's a kind of complexity here about sort of attitudes to fiction. So that was a little bit of philosophy that I snuck in there, because you might think, well, hang on, when I was watching the movie of Godzilla, I was really scared. And yet I don't think that Godzilla exists. So maybe you can have emotions towards non-existent objects. But there's a big difference between your fear in the movie theater and the fear that you would actually have if you were walking down the street and Godzilla appeared, right? Because in the one case, you would run away. And in the other case, you stay there and you want more. Right. Even though you're scared. So there's a sense in which you know that it's just make-believe when you're in the movie theater. It's not that the emotions aren't real, but the way that you interpret them is very different from the way that you would. I mean, they're not connected to action in the way that fear can be, real fear. Right. So I don't think that kind of point about the way that we actually can have attitudes of a kind towards fictional objects, sort of in a certain sense, make believe attitudes, is going to and then enable you to come back and say, so see, atheists really do hate God after all. It's just that from their point of view, it's like the pretend fear of Godzilla. But that doesn't seem right to me. And most atheists, I think, when it comes to sort of effective attitudes, if they're the kinds of atheists who just think that there's no God, they don't have it, no emotions come up in connection with God. Maybe emotions come up when the missionaries knock on the door yet again, and you've got to go out and, oh, God, I'm going to go and argue with them again, right? that kind of thing. But that's got nothing to do with attitudes towards the content of their beliefs. It's to do with them sort of wrecking yet another weekend for you.
Yeah. Spoken like someone that's suppressing the truth and unrighteousness. No, but it's funny because I come from a Calvinist background as a Christian, so I know that like the Romans 1 interpretations and stuff like that. So like some people, I think, for purely theological reasons, they rationalize everything like that. It's not because they personally, it's not necessarily because they're trying to protect. Like, I think on the one hand, the reason people do that is because it's like a really profound like belief protection mechanism. You can just rationalize everything in terms of like, no matter what you do, it's because like you have wrong motives or whatever. And I think some people that have that view of Romans 1, like their experience doesn't bear that out, but like they're committed to a theological system where like they have to kind of put those glasses on and look at it that even though they wouldn't necessarily like be motivated to do it in for any other reason. But again, my personal speculation.
Yeah, so that could be right.
Yeah. So what about the fact that atheism just another religion?
So, okay, so now we kind of have to go back to the definition of religion.
Right.
I think it turns out that I mean, there's a bunch of things that you typically see in religions, and you pretty much see none of them in atheism. And so on any account, it's going to be massively implausible that atheism is a religion. There's no scripture, there's no dogma, there's no priests, there's no organization, there's no requirements to make sacrifices of one kind or another, and so on. Through all the various things, there are no designated holidays and so on, right? It's just obvious. Like when you look around the world and you look at the religions, so you look at the Abrahamic religions and Buddhism and Hinduism and Taoism and so on, and you look at their commonalities, and there are many. And then you look at atheism and there's pretty much none.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So the answer is no.
But atheism is unlivable, though. What about that?
So,
Can't live it out.
So if there are times when it was very hard to be an atheist. So if you think about Western Europe between 1000 and about 1770, right? For much of that time, let's just focus in on a particular time. So in 1660 in Scotland, a law was passed that made it a capital offence to persistently publicly affirm atheism, right? And the last person, perhaps the only person, but the last person to be put to death under that law was in 1697, a university student in Edinburgh called Thomas Aikenhead, who was hanged. Now, yes, he persistently publicly affirmed atheism. Was that why he was put to death? Well, it's not clear, right? The people who put him to death, the clerics and the politicians, had other agendas, right? But there was a law there.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And you can bet that law had a chilling effect on other atheists, of whom I'm sure there were many, though you wouldn't know, because in those circumstances, you're not going to put your hand up and say, over here, atheist, right? Yeah.
I think one of the other things you mentioned was like the like no atheists in foxholes kind of argument, sort of thing. And it does seem like, I think what they're getting at is like, you know, some people, if you're in kind of a situation where, you know, life and death is on the line, people throw Hail Mary passes, if you will. So like, I guess there might be a sentiment of like, you know, if I was, you know, like if I was in danger of dying, you know, I may throw like God, if you're there, help me, you know, like one of those kind of prayers, even if I don't really believe it. If I was like rationally thinking, I might not believe it, but they might take that kind of sentiment and be like, well, see, you deep down do believe in God, even though like I think you pointed out, a lot of the people that return from wars, that actually scars them. And then they become like, no, there's no way there's a perfect being in charge of the universe after all this stuff that I've seen. So it's kind of like, I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So there's a noticeable decline in religious belief in the 20th century. So if you look in a country like Australia, the census in 1900, 98% of people tick the Christian box. After the First World War, that number's going down, and it keeps going down as we, you know, the Second World War, and it's going down.
Right.
And it does seem to be that there's a plausible explanation for what's going on, at least in part, is that the wars were so horrible that it destroyed. People just thought, like, this world does not have a good governance, right?
Right.
So I think that's plausible.
Sort of moving to the end though. So the chapter about arguing for in favor of atheism. And so I feel like that chapter was sort of a summary of the best argument against God. I don't remember. Well, maybe, yeah, you wrote the best argument against God before you wrote this book, I think.
Yeah. Yes.
And so it seemed, because I read the other one as well, and it seemed like this chapter was kind of a distillation of some of the stuff you wrote in the best argument against God. So go ahead.
So that was the idea. It's a kind of summary of that, but also just a restatement of what I said about that argument. I mean, from memory, I've got some more stuff in there thinking about other things that you might try to do by way of arguing for atheism. You might try to show that theism's logically inconsistent, or you might try to show that there's some evidence that there's a kind of that just decisively refutes it. There's a range of, you might say that it's meaningless, right? The claim that there's a God actually has no meaning, and there's a range of things that you could try saying. And I dismiss each of those, and then I say, here's what I think is the best you can do. But even this argument is not by any standards a successful argument. It's a thing that requires judgment, and people's judgments could reasonably differ. So you could entirely not be persuaded by this argument, but it's the best kind of argument that we could hope to produce. So that's a very broad summary of the chapter. And then the way that I think that a decent argument's going to go is it's going to have to effectively take some opposing position. So because we're talking about atheism. So imagine a best version of theism, imagine a best version of some developed atheistic worldview. A naturalistic worldview is the one I favour, so I'll go with that. and then think about how we're going to compare them in order to determine which one's the better worldview. One thing we're going to do is check for consistency, and then we're going to just see which one does better at managing the trade-off between kind of minimizing its commitments and maximizing explanation. So basically, which one's the more virtuous theory? How do you work out what the virtues of a theory are? Well, they don't commit you to more than you need, and they explain as much as possible. And so there's a kind of trade-off there that we're trying to manage. The way I see it, atheism, so naturalism, is simpler, and it explains everything, at least as well as theism does. So it's a better view. But if you're a theist, you might disagree. And indeed, amongst my theistic philosophical colleagues, there are some that want to argue that actually theism is simpler, and there's a lot more who want to argue that when you think about all the data, theism fits it a lot better than atheism does, right? So you end up, as you might expect, you end up with a stalemate, even with respect to what looks like the best argument. One last thing to say is the argument that I've just described is in a way quite similar to Richard Swinburne's argument for the existence of God. I mean, he also wants to say, exactly the opposite of what I said. Theism's simpler and it explains all the data better, right? So there's a kind of very direct contrast between us in our assessment of what's essentially the same data.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think recently I read, maybe in the last couple of months, Is God the Best Explanation of Things by Felipe Leon and Joshua Rasmussen. And I know that Rasmussen was arguing basically, yes, theism is simpler. And so that's definitely interesting. Like, what would you, like, briefly, why do you disagree with him that, and think that naturalism is simpler than theism?
Okay, so this is slightly complicated. So what he thinks is that his fundamental entity is simpler than mine, because his fundamental entity is God, whereas my fundamental entity is maybe the universe. And it's not exactly clear what my fundamental entity is. I think that that's kind of irrelevant to the assessment, because the way that I want to assess simplicity, it has to do with theories of everything that we're, and whether there's a fundamental entity and what its properties are is kind of irrelevant to the assessment of the simplicity of the two theories. And I don't know how much you want to get into this, but the way I think that you assess the simplicity of a theory, or you compare the simplicity of two theories, is think about if you axiomatize the theory, right? So the theory is just a list of claims.
Right.
What you want. So one thing you can do is imagine axiomatizing it. So you've got a small set of claims that, and all the other claims are a logical consequence of it. So one thing is, how much can you compress into the axioms? How small and simple can you make the axioms? And then another question is, how many things are you committed to by your theory? Not fundamental things. How many things are you committed to? Right. Of course, we only have to look at the axioms, because whatever follows from the axioms is kind of we get for free. So we look at the axioms and say, okay, what do the axioms commit you to? Now, it's kind of, as you can see, since we can't actually axiomatize our theories, it's a bit unclear how to operationalize this method. But it seems to me that the kind of intuitive picture is like this. The naturalist believes in the universe, and there's some way of describing the universe in terms of physical theory and chemistry and chemical theory and biological theory and so on, that's going to be optimal, right? And so the theist is going to take all of that stuff and then add God to the picture,
right?
And some properties of God, and that's just loss, right? Because there's no data that adding that in is going to explain better, according to the naturalist. But your theory is more complicated because you've got this extra stuff in there.
No, that makes perfect sense, at least intuitively, because I always, most Christians, hammer home on the distinction between the creator and the creation, the creator-creation distinction. And so to me, I don't understand what you say, like theism is simpler. Well, I mean, you've already distinguished between creation and creator. You're not, so how is it simpler? And that, so I totally understand what you're saying. And it's interesting too. I ran, I'm interested in like Bible stuff as well, other than philosophy of religion, like biblical studies. And so one of the reasons that I don't think the Bible is divinely inspired is because I would kind of run an argument similar kind of in thinking to the way you approach naturalism and theism. I would say, okay, we have all this data. You can explain the data of the Bible at least as well, if not better, by just appealing to human beings rather than just adding an additional divine hand to the picture. And so therefore you don't need that explanation. So because there's some, the more fundamentalist people want to point to like, well, there's this prophecy of Jesus that was, in the past and it really pointed to the future or whatever. But there are more liberal leaning Christians that they don't need these objective features in the text. And so they'll just say, well, I have this feeling. That's kind of oversimplifying it, but they Reformed epistemology. I don't want to be mean, but they have this sense that it's from God or whatever. And it seems like just religious experience and looking at the text, if you abandon a conservative, inerrantist, or whatever position, it doesn't seem like there's anything you can't explain by just appealing to human beings, and that's a simpler explanation. So anyway, I'm not going on my own tangent here, but I like that. Someone pushed back against that and basically said the exact same thing that people say for the theism naturalism thing. And I'm like, I don't know. It just seems weird to me. To think
there's lots of stuff there, because there's also these arguments about how Christianity became the dominant force that it became after Constantine. There was a bit of a relapse but then, from the 5th century onwards, it became dominant throughout Western Europe, and that dominance was never then challenged, not in Western Europe. And the idea is that if Christianity hadn't been true, it would never have come to that position of dominance. And that just seems like an incredibly weak argument to me.
Yeah. Okay. Totally agree. So we're close. We're a little over an hour, but let me wrap up a couple more things I wanted to say too. We'll go a little bit briefly. So, the future of atheism. One of my observations is it seems like religious affiliation is declining, and some people might take that to mean that atheism simpliciter is on the rise. But I don't necessarily think that's because the nuns or whatever you want to call them, not all of them are atheists. So what do you think about the future of atheism specifically, and like how that relates to, religious affiliation seemingly going down?
So, okay. So this is an interesting question. The nuns have definitely been on the rise, and maybe by the next census in Australia, the nuns might reach 50%.
Wow.
Right, which is it's well over 35% now. But lots of them have spiritual beliefs.
Yes. Yep.
Many of them even claim to believe in God. Right. It's hard. The census just doesn't collect the data in the right kind of way. But our census, you get to tick one box. If you tick no religion, well, you're done. Right. That's all we've got to go on. So, there are more fine-grained studies that Pew and other organisations have done, but it's not clear that they show a very dramatic rise in people who say that there are no gods, right? Which is the thing I'm interested in. Maybe there's some, but it's not clear. So that's the kind of first point, that we don't have very good data about this. The second thing is that religion is hardly in decline across the world. And it's in decline in Western democracies largely, and not showing much by way of decline anywhere else. And there are some places where religion's clearly been gaining ground. So Russia would be one place where religion's sort of on the rise. And China's an interesting case. They repress some, the Chinese authorities repress some religions, but not all. So these days. And then, through Africa, there's this kind of battle going on between Christians and Muslims trying to convert people in Africa. And there's a big rise, I think, of religion there as well. So it's very hard to project from this, even if we could do a projection just based on what's happening right now with, is the total number of religious people going up or down. But it's much more complicated than that, because the conditions under which religion has declined since the beginning of the 20th century might be quite special and might not be projectable into the future. So it might be that there's just going to be a bounce back. We don't know.
Yeah, I'm interested to see as well. Like it's so much. It's not enough. Like the internet is so new as well too, and it's like how has that and how will that affect it? And like it's just there's so many factors that it just seems. Again, it seemed like your message at the end was like let's take a step back and not make any foolhardy projections in the future either way, because it's so we can't know for sure really where this is headed.
Yeah. So I found some people who in 2000 and 2005 made confident predictions that atheism was in decline, and then you look at the demographic data and atheism's gone on growing. You think they can't have looked at the demographic data, and if they did, goodness knows how they managed to make the projections that they did, because they just haven't been borne out. So that's on the kind of one side. But on the other side, here we are in 2021. What's it going to be like in 2030? I don't know. Right.
Right. It's hard to say. The other two more things. So there was one at the beginning of the book, you had mentioned like atheism doesn't have anything to do with like your level of conviction towards whether there is a God or gods or whatever. Personal question: what is your level of conviction in atheism? Are you more of a, I don't know how you, because there's a spectrum obviously. Like, so how are you?
So these things are hard to estimate. I want to. So I've talked about this occasionally before. So I'm just going to repeat what I've said previously. For practical purposes, I'm a zero. Right. I don't think ever what would God want me to do, or anything like that. Right. The way that I kind of live my life day to day, I just don't give any credence to that claim. Should I say that it's zero? Well, I'm going to say that I'm going to call it epsilon, where epsilon is this quantity that when you look at it from one point of view, it's zero. And when you look at it from a different point of view, it's completely insignificant, but non-zero, right? It's so small that even theoretically, it doesn't make a difference. Now, this is not, I'm not recommending this. I'm just reporting.
Right. No,
attitudes. I just,
Yeah. And the last thing too, is what are your future projects? Like, is there anything you're working on now or that you're looking to do in the future?
So I'm probably going to have a bit of a break from philosophy of religion. I've got a project on the nature of arguments, which is not unrelated to stuff that I've done in philosophy of religion, but I want to write a book about argumentation. And I have a grant, which hasn't started yet, but will soon, to do some research on various aspects of argumentation. And I'm hoping that in 3 or 4 years, I'll produce a book on that topic. I'm not going to do nothing in philosophy of religion over that time, but that will certainly be the big project that I'm working on. And so I will be doing less stuff in philosophy of religion than I have in the last 25 years.
Okay. Well, I think that's a good stopping point, but thank you so much for being generous with your time. I really enjoyed this discussion. We can talk, I'm going to end the broadcast, but we can talk for like a minute after this. But yeah, thanks again for coming on.
Okay, no worries. Thank you.